Well, there's a generation of people who have been told that everything in the world can be understood by looking at it through the lens of patriarchy or cis heteronormativity or any of the other bollocks that they've taught themselves and been taught and told throughout their lives. And it's quite interesting, isn't it, when something like a pandemic comes along, which very few people have been thinking about in the period before. If you are one of those people who said everything can be understood because of the patriarchy, then how does the pandemic fit into that? You know, is it old white men who gave us the pandemic? You know, your mind the mind starts to work out ways in which this new thing can fit into the pre-existing set of ideas, and a lot of people do that. I mean, we all do it in our little ways, but the identitarians of the far left who've been obsessing about identity politics in recent years, they are completely stuck in this. And they started, you could see it happening, they started to try to find ways to adapt to this new scenario. And the ways they came up with were characteristically pitiful and shallow. But they were things like, you know, women are suffering disproportionately from coronavirus than the men. You know, and who outside some weird cult would want to indulge in a game like that? Well, it's worse than that. Who but members of a weird cult who need to see everything adapt to their viewpoint would persist, even when the facts prove otherwise. So when it was shown that actually men disproportionately die, or men die in larger numbers from the coronavirus, these same people were just adamant to keep with their pre-existing ideas. Well, the men might be doing the dying, but the women are doing the suffering, this sort of thing. And this was written in major publications, major newspapers across the Western world, across the English-speaking world in particular. And so, yes, these people all tried to adapt to the new situation. And then they had their best chance with the killing of George Floyd at the end of May. And at that point, those people who had spent all their lives saying everything is to be understood through the prism of race, and specifically white racism towards other people, had their best open goal for a while, and they took it. And they ran at it with everything they had. And they did it so much that they actually used it to trump the coronavirus. And this wasn't a fringe thing. Hundreds of American scientists and experts in medical fields signed a joint letter agreeing that BLM protests superseded the coronavirus as a matter of importance. They said, yes, it's true that we've said that nobody can gather. It's true that, you know, we've all been told not to meet our friends and family for months and been locked in our houses. It's true that the medical advice is not to mix, but there is one exception. And the one exception, these hundreds of healthcare professionals said, was BLM. And it was because they said systemic racism is also a pandemic. And so it trumps coronavirus. It trumps social distancing. It trumps all of that. And I think this is simultaneously both totally reprehensible and wholly predictable. Because if you see the whole world through the prism of skin color and playing these dark, unpleasant, hierarchical games of who wins where and who should win and who has the right to speak and who has the right to, etc. If you're doing all that, then of course you've got to try to adapt the new, you know, existing order that we're in the pandemic era to your points of view. And that's what they've done. They said, yeah, okay, sure, there's this pandemic that's locked us all in our houses, but racism.
See online, a lot of people are drawing maybe some parallels between what has gone on in the world this year and maybe your experiences personally at Evergreen. How aware were you back then of what was coming, and is this something that you could have possibly predicted or foreseen?
Well, not only could I have predicted it, but I did predict it rather directly. If people want to go and take a look at my congressional testimony, for example, I warned the Congress that what they were seeing on college campuses was not about college campuses, that was the first major battle, and it had very little to do with free speech, that free speech was a casualty of a movement that was about power. And the fact is, what I predicted, which is that this would spill out into civilization, that it would take over many institutions, that it would threaten our system of governance. All those things are now increasingly understood, and many people have pointed out just how accurate the prediction was. Now, to be fair, even I'm surprised at the speed with which this has happened.
Where do you personally see this social justice movement heading, as it almost has a compound effect?
Well, it really depends what happens in the upcoming election. If the Democrats prevail in the U.S., I expect them to attempt to manage the social justice movement cynically, and I expect them to lose control of it, which will be a disaster. If the Republicans win, then I expect that they will crack down on dissent and cause a backlash. But either way, it looks like our growing obsession with race is going to dominate the conversation, and that places not only the U.S., but the West in grave jeopardy.
Do you find it strange that we've been getting lectured about privilege from a prince and a princess?
Oh, I think it's beautiful. I mean, sometimes things just write themselves, don't they? Yes, the privilege game. I'm not into the privilege game, by the way, because I think it's irreducible. I think you can't ever finish the game. And can I explain why for a second? Because,
please.
Because first of all, it shifts all the time in our lives. I mean, you may say, for instance, some people would, that if you are rich, that you have privilege. Well, you do actually. I mean, you have a form of privilege. You have certain advantages over people who are poor, certainly over the very poor. If you are very beautiful, you've got a lot of advantages over people who are really, really ugly, or just plain. I mean, you're going to have a lot of advantage in your life because of that. People are going to want to be near you more. You'll find it easier to find a mate and a partner, and much more. There are lots of things like that which you could point to and you could say that's a privilege, but you never do know what other things in that person's life might be going on. Like, do people actually think that everyone who's beautiful is also wildly happy or well? Does everyone actually think that the rich don't suffer anything? And now the question then is, what's your hierarchy exactly here? Like, does a rich person with a drug problem and mental health issues ever meet a poor person who's mentally well and physically well? Like, no one knows, because you couldn't work that out. There is no way of working that out. What about day to day? What about somebody who seems to have every advantage in life and then crashes the whole damn thing? Are they privileged? Were they before? Are they after? And who has the time to work that out? I mean, we would have to be permanently asking each other how we were, to be answering each other completely honestly and frankly with up to the minute information. We don't have the time. We don't have the time to do that. Now, the result is we make certain sweeping generalizations. You might make a sweeping generalization such as, I don't know, somebody who speaks like me is wildly privileged, for instance. We do that. We do that a lot with accents, particularly in the UK. But then what do you do after that? You say everyone who's been to a certain university is particularly privileged. Well, they've got a type of privilege. What about people who've gone to university and they're the first people in their family to have been to university? Are they privileged? Where exactly do they land in this? And so I think it's a really unpleasant game to play. And it's reductionist. It doesn't understand the complexity of us as people, or the variety of ways in which people go up and down in their own lives. But watching members of the Windsor family indulging in this game is remarkable, because of course it's such a precarious game for them to play. I wrote about this when the Sussexes started doing this, I think last year, in was it Vogue magazine or GQ or one of the other Bibles of the intelligentsia. They did an article in which Harry started wittering on about instinctive bias and unconscious bias and racism and so on. And then they started getting into a variety of other things. And I thought, well, I know where this is going. It's the same boring playbook that so many other people have been rolling off in our era. But as I said at the time, watch out, Harry and Meghan, because this ends with the privilege discussion. And it's possible, I would put it no stronger, it's possible that the second son of the heir to the throne is not going to win an attempt to be seen as lacking in privilege. Now, there's a few ways in which he could do so. I mean, again, let's play this very unpleasant game that we're being encouraged to play. You could say, well, he has grown up as I think the third or fourth in line to the throne, and this makes him very privileged. That's true. You could then say he lost his mother when he was very young, so he then loses a certain amount of privilege because he deserves a certain amount of sympathy, and he does, I think, for that. But then how far do you take this, and how exactly do you weigh it up? He is attractive. He's had that advantage. I suspect that if he looked less attractive than he did, he'd have found fewer women throwing themselves at him, had fewer sexual and marital opportunities. But even if he was very unattractive, he would have had the advantage of who he is, and a certain number of women would still have thrown themselves at him for the pleasure and privilege of becoming a princess. So this goes on and on. And when you start to talk in these terms, you realize just how impossible it is to weigh this whole thing up. If you can't do it with one person, and you can't with him, how the hell do you think you're going to do it across an entire society all the time?
Do you remember when there was an article written, could have been in The Guardian, about David Cameron, the former Prime Minister, about his child, that sort of implied because he was the Prime Minister and white, that he wasn't allowed, the mourning of his dead child, which I think was like 8 or something, that even because of his privilege, it sort of didn't count.
Yes. It was a Guardian editorial, by the way.
Okay.
It was the editorial that day in the Guardian newspaper. Yes, they said that he may have suffered, but it was privileged suffering he'd had. And you think, how inhumane do you have to become to be try to start weighing up the privilege of a father losing his son? This should be a warning to everyone of what happens when you play that game. You end up trying to weigh up comparative grief. Comparative grief. That's what it is. And that's where this will always lead. It'll lead to inhumane things like that. And by the way, one other point on that. You make yourself, if you play this game, you make yourselves incredibly vulnerable as individuals and as a society for the following reason, which is that even if the game were somehow, I don't say winnable, but completable, shall we say, even if it were completable as a game, it would rely on everybody always playing the game honestly. Now, is it possible that there are some people in society, I wouldn't want to guess what percentage they make up, who, when they see an advantage, will seize it, even if it means using that advantage dishonestly? Might it be the case, for instance, that there are people who would, on the outside, appear to have had every imaginable privilege in their life, who decide to play the victim because they live in an era where victims are more celebrated than anyone else. Might such a type of person emerge? Might there be people, for instance, who pretend that they've suffered more racism than they have in their lives because they recognize that to make that claim will advantage them? Might it be the case that there were people who claimed that they've always been prejudiced against as a woman because it could help them now? Might it be the case that there will be people who will say that they've suffered homophobic disadvantages because they will sense that in this moment that could get them a notch further ahead? Oh, you bet there are. You bet there are. Well, how do you weed them out? How do you weed those people out from the sincere people? Answer: we can't. You can't. I can't. Nobody can. And so we get into this terrible game which has no end, which can't be won, and in which you are constantly vulnerable to dishonest actors. That's why I say don't play it. Don't play it.
So what would be an example of, as you say, a parasitic idea?
Sure. So the granddaddy of them all would probably be postmodernism, because in a sense it is the perfect virus of intellectual terrorism or nihilism, because it basically posits that there are no objective truths. Everything is constrained by subjectivity, by the personal biases of whomever is doing the exploration. Now, the problem is that scientists do wake up every day thinking that there are universal truths to be discovered. Now, something that is true 300 years ago scientifically might be updated and no longer be true. So in science, we talk about provisional truths. So when we say truth, we don't mean that it is revealed truth, as would be the case in science, in religion. But we do wake up every day thinking, well, there is a universal human nature that we might want to study as evolutionary psychologists. Well, postmodernism completely shatters that idea. And so I compare postmodernists to the 9/11 guys. So the 9/11 folks, because they were zealots of their ideology, flew planes onto buildings. Well, postmodernists fly planes of bullshit onto our edifices of reason and slowly destroy everything that has made, the scientific method and other such epistemological approaches completely irrelevant, because hey, it's all subjective. I'll give you maybe a quick story. Some of your viewers might not be familiar with it, others may, but it's still worth hearing if they know it. In 2002, one of my doctoral students had just defended his dissertation, and we had gone out for a celebratory dinner, myself, my wife, him, and his date for the evening, somebody that he was dating. And he had warned me ahead of time that that particular individual, the date in question, was a graduate student in cultural anthropology, postmodernism, and feminism. So sort of a holy trinity of bullshit.
The dark triad.
The dark triad. And so he was sort of telling me, hey, let's not get too heavy. Let's have fun. I said, oh, you got it. Mum's the word. I'm going to be on my best behavior, which of course was nonsense. I wasn't going to be on my best behavior. And so about halfway through the dinner, I very gingerly, very politely said, oh, I hear that you are a postmodernist. Do you mind if, so there are no universal truths, correct? Yes, none. Okay, well, do you mind if I propose what I think are universal truths, and then you can tell me how you would think otherwise? She goes, yes, absolutely, go for it. Okay, well, within Homo sapiens, only women bear children. Is that not a human universal? Is that not true? Can we not take that to the bank? Absolutely not. What a stupid thing to say. Oh, really? How's that? Well, there is a Japanese tribe off some island where within their mythological narrative, within their folklore, it is the men who bear children. So by you restricting it to the biological realm, that's how you keep us barefoot and pregnant. Once I recovered from my mini stroke, I then said to her, okay, how about we take a less contentious example, one that's not as laden with, animus as saying that only women bear children. She goes, go for it. Well, is it true that from the vantage point of anywhere on Earth, sailors have relied since time immemorial that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west? To which she used what's called deconstructionism. She said, well, what do you mean by east and west? Those are just labels. And what do you mean by sun? That which you call the sun, I call dancing hyena. To which I answered, well, the dancing hyena rises in the east and sets in the west. And then she said, well, I don't play these label games. So the reason why I always repeat this story, because she wasn't an anomaly. She wasn't an outlier. She was just aping what, 30, 40 years of this kind of bullshit training has caused people to do, which is reject that there is something called the sun, reject that women bear children, and so on. So it's not a good epistemological trajectory to take. So that would be the top idea pathogen. If you have time and you want to discuss others, I'd be happy to.
Gad Saad, who was on the show, his episode was actually released today. When he came on the show, he said that we need to activate our inner honey badgers.
Yes.
The honey badger, which is this small animal about the size up to the knee.
I've seen it in action.
Wow.
You should describe it for your listeners who haven't encountered it.
So the honey badger is this small animal, which is up to about the height of one's knee, about a 6-foot adult or so. Very small, looks, quite harmless. But when you encounter one, its resilience and its ferocity, if you just type in honey badger baseline, it can take on 6 lions.
Yes.
Now, when I heard this analogy, 2 people came to my mind. J.K. Rowling and the lady in Portland, Oregon, that would not raise up her hand to the BLM crowd. What do you think of those 2 honey badgers?
I admire both women. I actually wouldn't say they were honey badgers. I should say, yes, I once saw a honey badger in action in Botswana when was following a leopard, and it was an amazing sight. This leopard at dusk was suddenly, we were following it for some time. Beautiful, beautiful sight, extraordinary creatures. And it saw something, and my guide said, it's going to pounce. And it did, and then there was an almighty fight and hissing, and the leopard ran away and cowered. And the guy said, it's a honey badger. I've got a honey badger. I was so pleased. I wanted to call up all my political metaphor friends and tell them immediately that I'd seen this. So yes, you're right. It's a type of animal that is nice and pliant until someone comes its terrain, and then it fights like hell. Yes, J.K. Rowling is a type of honey badger in a way. I would say that she doesn't actually fight like hell. Like she doesn't assault and throttle the opponents in the way that some of us might. She's much more house trained, and a much nicer person than some of us. She undoubtedly protects her terrain, and really admirably. She doesn't need to. She's one of the people I see as being the adults in the room. She is very, very left wing by all of her past pronouncements and actions and donations and more. So it's another reminder this isn't some kind of left-right divide. She just really doesn't like it when people pretend that women don't exist. And I hugely admire her for making sure that she continues to make the argument. But as I say, the striking thing about J.K. Rowling, in a way, is that she does this so decently. I mean, her critics, such as they are, and they're really not meaningful in their arguments. But the critics say things like, J.K. Rowling wants me dead, It happened when there was a letter of support signed by Tom Stoppard, Ian McEwan, and many other very distinguished literary figures recently in her support, that they got this as well. Oh, I'm so distressed to discover that Ian McEwan wants to kill me, says trans activist Xena Warrior Princess. And this is a totally dishonest and a reprehensible way to behave by these activists. But they aren't actually responded to by Rowling or those figures who signed that letter in a honey badger way. I mean, they aren't completely mauled in the way that, in a way, I would like to see them mauled. I mean, I'd like to see Rowling suing the hell out of everyone. I'd like to see her, really make people pay a price for lying about her and pretending that, she wants to kill trans people and other outrageous defamatory things. she's more restrained than that. She makes her case. She makes it with great elegance and great care and great empathy. By the way, I mean, she doesn't, she doesn't sort of just say, bog off tranny or something, in the way that people pretend. She quite rightly says, I respect the fact there are trans people and they need and deserve full rights like everyone else. All of this is perfectly true. I totally agree with this. I say as much in the trans chapter in the Madness of Crowds. There's a real thing here, and these are real people we're talking about, and they deserve love and compassion and support to the extent that you can give it. But that does not include pretending that chromosomes don't exist. It doesn't include allowing men with big dicks and hairy chests into female-only places. It doesn't mean anything like that. By the way, none of which is some weird transphobe imagination thing. It's stuff that's happened and had real-life consequences. Some years ago when this argument was gone round, and people said, well, what happens if you put trans women in women's prisons? What if they molest the inmates? And people say, oh, what a transphobic thing to say, and so on. And then there have been cases, a very prominent one in the UK, of a man who identified as a woman going into a women's prison and raping a number of the inmates, who included people who had already been subjected to domestic abuse and domestic violence. And so, you do pay a price for lies. And Rowling and a few others have said, we're not willing to pay that price. We want to be able to argue this out, and we want to explain the truth as we see it. And they've done that, and they've done it in the face of, as I say, incredibly dishonest people, and in spite of unbelievably defamatory and unfair claims by their opponents. But they've persevered, and I wish there were more people like that. I say in one of the chapters in Madness of Crowds, the roll call of remarkable women, quite small in number, it has to be said, the roll call of remarkable women who have fought this corner and deserve great respect for having done so.
Gad Saad says that the granddaddy of all pathogenic ideas is postmodernism. And I think he said on this show that when you start to negate the scientific truth, that's a one-way ticket to living in a toxic world. Do you agree?
Oh, well, I absolutely agree. I've discussed this with Gad many times. He's a great explainer of this. I mean, in essence, the idea that because white men have made discoveries of the past, that something is either inherently wrong, or that science is somehow systemically racist, or that math or physics or anything else. These things, these are the great unifiers. Math is the great unifier of the universe. The idea that if you discover a scientific discovery, or you can unfurl a mathematical equation, and suddenly your lived experience is, meaning I'm a transsexual Black Latina lesbian or something, that supersedes the problem that you've solved, the equation that you've solved, the discovery that you've made. That's actually crazy, and that is at the essence of postmodernism. That your lived experience somehow is more important than what is empirically true. And look, the simple way to look at this is these immutable characteristics things that they're trying to make us really care about. The truth is, we all know it's not right. And how do you know? Well, if you right now had a heart attack, would you care what the color of the skin or the gender or sexuality was of the doctor? Of course you wouldn't. Of course you wouldn't. You would want the best doctor. If the doctor ran in, you're having a heart attack right now, right? Time is limited, you're in chest pain, you can't breathe, blah, blah. And the doctor walked in, you looked, and the doctor's a white heterosexual male. Would you ever say, no, I'm sorry, I would prefer that we had a Black trans woman here? Of course you wouldn't. Would you want your plane to be flown by the most qualified pilot, regardless of those characteristics, or because of those characteristics? I think we all know the answer to that. But again, we pretend that these are fights that we're supposed to be having for some very bizarre reason.
Quote I found of yours, and that is, a movement opposes science when it doesn't want assertions tested, challenges arithmetic when its claims don't add up, ridicules merit when it wants to triumph by other means, seeks to censor when it fears discussion, and those who coddle such demands sow the seeds of our undoing. So my question to you would be, what could happen to a society that chooses to negate the scientific truth?
A society that rejects science is effectively like a driver that puts on a blindfold. They might not crash right away, but it's coming soon. It is effectively an invitation to a dark age, which means an age in which progress comes to a halt and injustice reigns. And anybody who understands the relationship between high quality insight into what is taking place and what is likely to happen based on different policy proposals knows that we must at all cost prevent this shift in our mindset.
One particular one which I enjoyed recently, which I know is close to you, is the Co-op, the lovely supermarket, making a sort of slight at the spectator. What did we learn about that?
Well, that was fun. I love, as in hate, woke corporations. We've seen quite a lot of it recently. We've seen Sainsbury's advertising that racists shouldn't come to our stores. We are a diverse store. As if, the KKK were forever gathering in the cereals aisle of the local Sainsbury's, sort of big risk of bumping into them. These totally fake and really quite divisive games being played by woke corporations. By the way, it's becoming increasingly hard to know where you can buy your groceries in the UK if you're a reasonable person who doesn't like woke corporations, because one by one they've been falling. And Marks and Spencer's hasn't done the worst, but they did all that crap like the LGBT sandwich to celebrate Pride Month, where they made a special sandwich which they promoted, which had lettuce, guacamole, something else, and tomato. Anyhow, it was some soggy mess, but they said it was for gay pride. So anyhow, if you buy your sandwiches depending on the acronym fitting LGBT, I suppose it's not the best way to do a recipe. But anyway, Marks and Spencer's has done that, Sainsbury's has done that, many of the banks have done that. But the Co-op, which hasn't been terrifically governed in recent years, you might have noticed, not least when it turned out the head of their board was a crazy old crystal meth addict, we had great fun he was a Methodist minister as well. I think we ran the headline in the Spectator on the front page about him with the crystal Methodist. I was quite pleased with that one. But he was head of the Co-op bang, and the whole thing was terribly badly run, and now they've come out as sort of woke Co-op, because of course that's what everyone wants when they're buying their pork pies and milk of a morning. The Co-op recently got into a fight with the Spectator because somebody who ran the social media account of the Co-op responded to a single complainant who said, "How dare, I was so disappointed to see that you've advertised in the Spectator this week, because the Spectator runs anti-trans material." I think the person in question appeared to be objecting, not for once, I think, to me, but to a number of very distinguished left-wing feminists we've published, such as Suzanne Moore, who have written very eloquently and brilliantly and wittily about these issues in the Spectator. Because of course we publish people from across the political spectrum, as long as they can write well and brilliantly, we have a whole range of voices. And anyhow, this person complained about us having the temerity to publish such women, and the Co-op said, a social media account said, "Oh, this was a terrible oversight. We're so sorry. It won't happen again, and we won't be advertising with the Spectator again." Well, that got the ire up of quite a lot of us. Our chairman, Andrew Neil, isn't a pushover, and he doesn't like that sort of thing, and he won't have. He quite rightly just will not have advertisers trying to dictate the editorial policy of the magazine they advertise in. It's an outrageous attempt to encroach upon the free press. And he said, "Well, actually, it doesn't matter because you're banned from advertising with us. We don't want the Co-op adverts." our editor Fraser Nelson took the same line, I went in as the sort of more paramilitary wing of the Spectator in a jihad against the Co-op, who I'd like to think just couldn't understand why these three Scotsmen had been woken from their lairs. And anyhow, in the end, actually, we had a groveling apology from the Co-op, and it was a good lesson, a very interesting lesson, by the way, because it demonstrated that quite often with these corporations, the people claiming to make those decisions are very young people with relatively little sway in the corporation. They haven't actually passed it by their bosses. This is a very interesting point. They haven't actually passed it by them. They've been given a certain power by being given the keys to the social media accounts. But that's quite different from the heads of the corporations. And in the case of Sainsbury's, for instance, I did this run over of the Sainsbury's board, the board of governors, and the board of the Sainsbury's Bank, and they are all, with one exception, I think, elderly white men. And I said, I think on Twitter, I said, this is what happens. You should know now that you think when you're playing these games, oi, KKK, keep out of Sainsbury's. You think that we think, oh, what a wonderful anti-racist organization we are. We don't. We think you've got something to hide. And the fact is you have, because you're playing a game that you're actually not playing. You're pretending to play a game. You're playing this game of diversity and wokeness, in part because the heads of your corporation don't fit to your own standards. Because actually, most of your bosses are men, most of them are white. So if you want to play that game, you're going to lose. You're going to lose the game that you have yourselves instigated, you idiots. I hope that people learn from this sort of episode. I really hope they do. Because I don't want that. I don't want to spend any of my life going through the boards of supermarkets, counting up how many men there are, or counting up how many people of color there are. I don't want to spend my time doing it. I don't think very many other people do. I think it's an unpleasant thing to have to do. But if you draw attention to yourselves by doing this, this is what you'll get, and you will not come out winning.
With that Affleck example we talked about, it makes me wonder how we've arrived at this state in which if a word is thrown against someone like racist or homophobe in a public setting, they automatically become that in the sort of the public eye. Then there's almost no judge or jury. It's straight to the executioner. And it makes me think of an example recently with J.K. Rowling, for example. I was watching a breakfast show here in the UK called Good Morning Britain, in which they were having a debate on whether J.K. Rowling's new book was transphobic. And the guy that was arguing that it was transphobic, he was talking really passionate about it. And Piers Morgan, the presenter, said to him, "Have you read the book?" And he said, "Well, no, but I've read a review of the book." And Piers said, we're having this argument. No one's read the damn thing.
Yeah.
So why do you think we've arrived at this place in which we're just so quick to sentence people to their death without even hearing them out?
Well, by the way, we should also note that J.K. Rowling's book, of course, is a work of fiction. It's a work of fiction, right? So transphobic. I mean, the word, when they put phobia on everything, phobia is an irrational fear. I don't think there's anyone really walking around that thinks that J.K. Rowling has an irrational fear of trans people, meaning that if she met a trans person, she would have an irrational fear of them. What she is saying is she doesn't want people to be forced to use specific pronouns. I've heard her say you want to treat people with respect. All of the things that any good, liberal, decent person would want are the same things that she wants. She doesn't want to be bludgeoned into having to bow to a mob or having to use specific words. This is real. You know what I mean? This is a real thing that any of us that care about freedom should want. But this is what they do with everything. Instead of having an honest discussion about J.K. Rowling's thoughts or the book, they either don't read the book or they argue with an imaginary position that she doesn't even really have. And also, you know, there's a real danger in this, that especially in the world of fiction. So if you were to write anything about a gay person, would that be homophobic? Anything about a trans person or a black person, would that be racist? I mean, Silence of the Lambs, which I think is probably the best horror movie of all time, Hannibal Lecter and Buffalo Bill. Buffalo Bill, the main bad guy, what was he doing? He was capturing women because he had a gender identity issue, and he was literally building a suit, a female suit to wear as a man. So there's some gender identity stuff there, right? There's some stuff that grapples with trans issues there. Is the argument that the author of the book, Silence of the Lambs, is that he was a transphobe? He came up with a deeply disturbing psychological thriller. That's a spectacular book and a spectacular movie. Jonathan Demme, I think, was the director. Is he a transphobe? Was Anthony Hopkins for playing Hannibal Lecter, who actually had some gender identity stuff of his own and sexuality stuff of his own? Was he homophobic? I mean, it's all just nonsense. But for some reason, partly fueled by social media, we pretend that these are real issues, but they're actually not real issues.
Regarding cancel culture, where do you think the main motive lies behind these people who almost find enjoyment in seeing the downfall of others?
I think this is a game theoretic problem. The movement says things that are mind-numbingly foolish, but its strategy is bordering on brilliance. And the way those two things happen together is that the strategy evolved over time. And cancel culture, which is a term I don't love, but let's use it just because it's the one we have. Cancel culture is a game in which people are captured. That's the point. Cancellation is the threat that causes people who don't believe something to act as if they do, and then to convince themselves that they do, to rationalize it into being. And so if you think about the logic of, let's say, a zombie movie, or, you know, in Game of Thrones, the Army of the Dead, the problem is that if you are killed by the Army of the Dead, you join it. And cancel culture has this aspect. In other words, if you look at the videos of people being confronted in cafes and being told to say certain words and make a black power fist, everybody there has a choice. You can either do what they ask, and then effectively you become an increase in the movement's momentum, or you can resist and be stigmatized publicly, which is something most people won't do. And so my point would be that those who are involved in cancel culture are people who have joined a movement that is offering a deal to people that most find hard to resist. You can join us and be doing what we do. You can add to the energy that we have to deploy, or you can oppose us and face it. And this movement is simply growing by virtue of the fact that the logic that people are handed when they are faced with cancellation drives most of them to embrace it and then participate.
Yeah. When I spoke to Bret Weinstein, we talked about social justice and the reason behind it. And the main thing I got from him, he seems to think that it all stems from people who are just trying to sort of substantiate some sort of meaning into their lives by attaching themselves to maybe like the first cause they see that's trending. Do you agree with that?
I think there's a lot of legitimacy to that. I think that, you know, the hole that Jordan Peterson filled at the peak of the Jordan Peterson movement, and obviously I was on tour with him for a year and a half, the main hole that he filled is the hole of purpose. You know, people think that life should just be about making you happy, or you should just be doing what you want all day long, or something like that. And that really isn't. It's about finding some purpose. And I'm not just saying that at some like intellectual level or something like that. I'm saying it in my own life. As I started saying what I was thinking, and then more people started finding me, it reinvigorated my ability to do that. And then I kept doing it. The things that I cared about kept growing. It helped me grow a business. It helped me buy a home. It helped me expand my family. And through that, I now have purpose. I wake up every morning, and trust me, I got a lot of stuff to do. But the cool part is I want to do most of it. You know what I mean? Like, I want to do it because I found purpose. And then, by the way, when you find true purpose that's fulfilling to you, not because you're bowing to a mob or pretending to, virtue signal that you care about something, when you find true purpose, well, you will find happiness through that. I'm not happy 24 hours a day. I'm still worried about the world, and I have fears and wants and, all of those things like everybody else. But purpose is the purpose of life is to find purpose. That's it. So a lot of these social justice warriors, they're sort of spinning around with no real meaning in their lives. And I think you could attach that there's no system of belief there too. And when you don't believe in anything sort of outside of yourself, you'll believe in anything that's right here. And then they hear, oh, Black Lives Matter, like as if it's your salvation. And then next thing you know, you're burning down a building and you're not even sure why you did it.